It's January 1781, and a brilliant American general is about to carry out one of the boldest military plans in history. He's going to lose battles on purpose, lead an entire British army on a deadly march through frozen wilderness, and somehow save the American Revolution by running away. This is the incredible, true story of how Nathaniel Greene turned running away into genius and changed the course of a war. But Greene had something that formal military training couldn't give him, a natural understanding of revolutionary warfare that was decades ahead of his time. During his earlier service in the war, he had shown an unusual ability to think about strategy rather than just tactics, while other generals focused on winning individual battles. Greene understood that the Revolutionary War was completely different from European conflicts. This wasn't about capturing territory or defeating armies in big battles. It was about breaking the British will to keep fighting. Greene's smart approach to warfare was revolutionary by itself. He read military books constantly, studying the campaigns of great generals throughout history. He understood logistics in a way that few of his fellow officers did, knowing that armies moved on their stomachs and that controlling supply lines was often more important than controlling battlefields. Most importantly, he understood the political side of military operations, knowing that in a revolutionary war, the support of the civilian population was the ultimate prize. When Greene arrived in Charlotte, North Carolina, in December 1780, he found a situation that would have broken a lesser man. His so-called army had fewer than 2,000 men, many of whom were barely soldiers at all. The Continental troops were a ragged bunch, most without proper uniforms, many without shoes, marching through the winter cold with feet wrapped in rags. Their weapons were a mix of different types and sizes, making ammunition supply a nightmare. Many had no bayonets, the essential weapon of 18th century warfare, leaving them at a severe disadvantage in close combat. The condition of these men was heartbreaking. They hadn't been paid in months, and many hadn't received enough food in weeks. Discipline was falling apart as soldiers searched for food, sometimes taking what they needed from civilians who could barely spare it. Disease was widespread in the camps, with dysentery, typhus, and smallpox taking a steady toll. Medical supplies were almost non-existent, and the army's few doctors were overwhelmed by the constant stream of sick and wounded men. Morale was perhaps the worst part of the situation. These men had suffered defeat after defeat, watching their friends killed or captured while they retreated again and again. They had seen their officers run from the battlefield at Camden, abandoning them to face the enemy alone. Many questioned whether the cause of independence was worth the suffering they were experiencing, and desertion was a constant problem. The local civilian population was equally discouraged. British forces had shown their ability to defeat American armies whenever they chose to fight, and many colonists had concluded that resistance was pointless. Some actively supported the British cause, providing information and supplies to enemy forces. Others remained neutral, unwilling to risk their lives and property for a cause that seemed doomed to failure. Only a few strong patriots continued to support the American effort, and even they were beginning to lose hope. Greene's supply situation was terrible. The Continental Congress, always struggling financially, could provide almost nothing in terms of money, food, or equipment. The state governments were either occupied by British forces or too weak to offer real help. Getting supplies locally was complicated by the fact that the army had no money to pay for supplies, and taking goods from civilians risked turning away the very people who support the Americans needed. The intelligence picture was equally bad. British forces controlled most of the major towns and supply routes in South Carolina, making it difficult to gather information about enemy movements and plans. The Americans had few reliable sources of intelligence, while the British had established an effective network of loyalist informants who could report on American activities. But as Greene looked at this terrible situation, his brilliant strategic mind was already creating a plan that would transform every apparent weakness into a potential strength. He understood something that had escaped previous American commanders in the South. The very factors that made his situation seem hopeless could become the keys to ultimate victory. Greene's first insight was about the nature of the enemy he faced. Cornwallis commanded a professional European army that was designed for fighting European-style wars. These forces were excellent at set-piece battles, siege warfare, and occupying territory. But they were less well-suited to the kind of warfare that America demanded, fighting across vast distances, maintaining long supply lines, and dealing with a hostile population that could provide intelligence to the enemy while denying it to British forces. The British Army was also limited by its own strengths. Its discipline and training made it powerful in battle. But these same qualities made it inflexible and slow to adapt to changing circumstances. British logistics were sophisticated but fragile, dependent on established supply lines and secure bases. When these were threatened, the entire system could collapse quickly. Moreover, every British soldier was irreplaceable, unlike the Americans, who could potentially recruit new soldiers from the local population. British reinforcements had to come from across the Atlantic Ocean, a journey that took months and could be stopped by French naval forces. Every casualty weakened Cornwallis's force permanently, while American losses could potentially be replaced by local recruitment. Greene also recognized that the British strategy in the South was based on a basic misunderstanding of American society. British leaders assumed that the rebellion was supported by only a small minority of the population, and that demonstrations of British military power would bring the majority back to loyalty. This assumption had worked in other parts of the British Empire where local elites could be won over or intimidated into supporting British rule. But America was different. The Revolution had created a truly popular movement that drew support from all levels of society. While British victories might temporarily discourage American resistance, they could not eliminate the underlying political and social forces that had created the rebellion in the first place. As long as American forces remained in the field, the possibility of ultimate victory remained alive. And as long as that possibility existed, the rebellion would continue. Greene's strategy was built on this understanding of the war's political dimensions. He would make the British pay such a high price for their military victories that they would eventually conclude that the cost of maintaining control over America exceeded any possible benefit to accomplish this. He needed to draw British forces away from their secure bases, stretch their supply lines to the breaking point, and force them to fight on terms that favored the Americans. The key to this strategy was mobility. Greene understood that his smaller, more lightly equipped force could move faster than Cornwallis's professional army, which was burdened with heavy equipment, extensive supplies, and the logistical requirements of European-style warfare. If he could keep his force mobile and avoid big battles, except on terms favorable to the Americans, he could gradually wear down British strength while preserving his own. This required a complete rethinking of military priorities. Instead of trying to hold territory, Greene would focus on preserving his army. Instead of seeking big battles, he would avoid them unless the circumstances were overwhelmingly favorable. Instead of fighting according to European military rules, he would adapt his tactics to American conditions and American strengths. Greene's first controversial decision was to divide his already small force, sending Daniel Morgan with about 800 men southwest toward the Broad River, while he took the rest northeast toward the Pedee River. This decision violated every principle of conventional military doctrine, which insisted that weaker forces should stay together to avoid being defeated separately. But Greene understood that conventional doctrine didn't apply to his situation. By dividing his force, Greene created multiple problems for Cornwallis that a concentrated army couldn't have achieved. The British general now had to decide which American force to pursue, and whichever choice he made would leave the other free to operate against British supply lines and loyalist militias. If Cornwallis divided his own force to pursue both American detachments, he would be weakening his own army and making it vulnerable to being defeated separately. More importantly, the division of Greene's force multiplied the psychological impact of American resistance. Instead of one small army that could be cornered and destroyed, there were now multiple American forces operating throughout the region. This created the impression that American resistance was stronger and more widespread than it actually was, encouraging Patriot supporters and discouraging Loyalists' collaboration. The decision also reflected Greene's understanding of the importance of morale and public opinion. A single, concentrated army constantly retreating from British forces might appear to be running in defeat. Multiple forces actively operating against British positions created the impression of an aggressive, confident resistance movement that was taking the fight to the enemy. Morgan's force operating near the Broad River was perfectly positioned to threaten British supply lines and Loyalist strongholds in the South Carolina backcountry. Morgan himself was an ideal commander for this type of operation. A veteran of the frontier wars, he understood irregular warfare in a way that few other American officers did. His men, mostly frontier riflemen, were skilled at the kind of hit-and-run tactics that would be most effective against British forces. Greene's own force, positioned near the Petey River, could threaten British communications with Charleston while remaining close enough to support Morgan if necessary. The two forces were far enough apart that Cornwallis couldn't attack both at the same time, but close enough that they could potentially combine if the strategic situation required it. Cornwallis, faced with this dilemma, made the decision that Greene had hoped he would make. The British general chose to pursue both American forces, sending Banastre Tarleton with his British Legion to hunt down Morgan while preparing his main force to move against Greene. This decision committed Cornwallis to the kind of campaign that Greene wanted, a pursuit across difficult terrain, far from British bases. In the middle of winter, Tarleton's pursuit of Morgan led directly to the Battle of Cowpens on January 17, 1781, one of the most brilliantly fought engagements of the Revolutionary War. Morgan, using his understanding of both his own troops and the enemy, deployed his forces in a formation that seemed to violate every rule of military science, but was perfectly adapted to the strengths and weaknesses of the forces involved. The battle plan was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Morgan placed his least reliable troops, the militia, in the front line with instructions to fire to volleys and then retreat. Behind them, he positioned his more experienced Continental troops, and behind them his cavalry reserve. The formation appeared to be a conventional line of battle, but it was actually a carefully designed trap. When Tarleton attacked, the battle unfolded exactly as Morgan had planned. The militia fired their volleys and retreated, drawing the British forward in pursuit. The Continental troops then engaged the advancing British, who were already disorganized by their pursuit of the militia. At the crucial moment, Morgan's cavalry struck the British flanks, while the supposedly retreating militia reformed and attacked the British rear. The result was a devastating American victory that virtually destroyed Tarleton's force. The British lost 110 killed, over 200 wounded, and more than 500 captured, along with their artillery, supplies, and baggage. American losses were minimal, 12 killed and 60 wounded. More importantly, the Americans captured crucial intelligence about British plans and capabilities. The victory at Cowpens was electrifying for American morale throughout the colonies. Here was proof that American forces could not only defeat British troops in open battle, but could do so decisively, capturing an entire enemy force while suffering minimal casualties themselves. The news spread rapidly through the colonies, reviving hope for the American cause just when it seemed darkest. But Greene understood that this tactical victory made his strategic situation more dangerous, not less. Cornwallis would now be determined to catch the Americans before they could escape with their prisoners and captured equipment. The British general's reputation and career were now on the line, and he would commit everything he had to destroying the American forces that had humiliated his subordinate. Cornwallis's reaction was exactly what Greene had expected. Furious at the destruction of Tarleton's force and determined to restore British prestige, the British general made the decision that sealed his fate. He would pursue the Americans with his entire army, abandoning his secure positions and supply lines to hunt them down in the wilderness. This decision played perfectly into Greene's hands. Instead of fighting the Americans on ground of their choosing, where they could use their advantages in mobility and local knowledge, Cornwallis was now committing to fight them in the vast wilderness of the Carolina backcountry, where every advantage lay with the defenders. The pursuit that followed, known to history as the Race to the Dan, was one of the most remarkable military campaigns of the Revolutionary War. Greene, having ordered Morgan to join him with his prisoners and captured equipment, began a fighting retreat that would cover over 400 miles of some of the most challenging terrain in North America. The Americans had several crucial advantages in this deadly game of cat and mouse. First, they were fighting on familiar ground. Many of Greene's officers and men were from the region and knew every river crossing, every road, every source of supply. They had local contacts who could provide intelligence about British movements and help with supplies and transportation. Second, the Americans were fighting for their survival, which gave them a motivation that their pursuers couldn't match. Every American soldier understood that capture meant death or imprisonment, and that defeat would mean the end of the Revolution in the South. This knowledge gave them the strength to endure hardships that would have broken men fighting for lesser stakes. Third, the Americans had a commander who understood that this retreat was not a sign of defeat, but the key to ultimate victory. Greene's confidence in his strategy communicated itself to his officers and men, helping them maintain discipline and morale, even under the most trying circumstances. The conditions during the race were horrible for both armies, but especially devastating for the British forces. January 1781 was one of the coldest winters on record in the Carolinas. Temperatures frequently dropped below freezing, and ice formed on rivers and streams. Rain turned the primitive roads into muddy swamps that could trap horses and artillery pieces. Snow made visibility difficult and covering ground dangerous for soldiers used to the mild climate of Charleston and the Georgia coast. These conditions were almost unbearable. British uniforms designed for European campaigns provided little protection against the fierce cold and constant dampness. Many soldiers had never experienced weather like this, had no idea how to protect themselves from frostbite and exposure. The British logistics system, which had worked well in coastal operations, completely broke down in the wilderness. Supply wagons became stuck in mud or bogged down by snow and ice. Rivers that were supposed to be crossable became raging torrents that swept away equipment and supplies. Roads that appeared on maps turned out to be little more than rough trails that were impossible for heavy equipment. Cornwallis's army was also carrying far more equipment and supplies than the Americans, which slowed their movement considerably. British artillery pieces, essential for siege warfare and set-piece battles, became enormous liabilities in the wilderness. Ammunition wagons, medical supplies, and the personal baggage of officers all had to be transported, creating a logistical tail that stretched for miles and moved at the pace of the slowest wagon. The horses suffered terribly during the march, fed on inadequate rations and forced to work in conditions they were not bred for. They began to die in large numbers. This forced the British to abandon artillery pieces and supplies, further weakening their military capabilities. The loss of cavalry horses was particularly devastating, as it reduced Cornwallis's ability to scout ahead and gather intelligence about American movements. Disease became a constant companion of both armies during the march. The combination of exposure, poor nutrition, contaminated water, and unsanitary conditions created ideal breeding grounds for typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia. The British medical services, already strained, were overwhelmed by the constant stream of sick and wounded men. Many soldiers who avoided death in battle died from disease during the march. For the Americans, conditions were equally harsh, but they were better prepared to endure them. Many of Greene's soldiers were from the frontier regions and were used to living rough in the wilderness. They knew how to find shelter, how to search for food, and how to protect themselves from the elements. Their lighter equipment loads also allowed them to move faster and with less logistical support. Perhaps most importantly, the Americans understood what they were trying to accomplish. Greene had explained his strategy to his officers, who in turn explained it to their men. Every soldier in the American army knew that they were not retreating in defeat, but carrying out a brilliant plan that would ultimately destroy their pursuers. This knowledge gave them the strength to endure hardships that might otherwise have broken their morale. Greene's management of the retreat was masterful. He used every advantage available to him, from detailed knowledge of the terrain to carefully coordinated deception operations. American forces would appear to be heading in one direction, only to change course suddenly when British pursuit got too close. False intelligence was planted where British scouts would find it, suggesting objectives and routes that would lead Cornwallis away from Greene's actual intentions. The American general also demonstrated remarkable leadership in keeping his army together during this grueling march. He shared the hardships of his men, marching on foot when horses were needed for the wounded and sick. He maintained strict discipline while showing flexibility in adapting to changing circumstances. Most importantly, he kept his officers and men focused on the larger strategic picture, constantly reminding them that their suffering was serving a greater purpose. Deeper into enemy territory. The constant harassment by militia forces made it clear that they were operating in hostile territory, where any civilian might be an enemy. British officers began to question the wisdom of the pursuit. Some recognized that they were being drawn into a trap. But Cornwallis was committed to the chase and refused to consider alternatives. The British general's personal honor was now tied to catching and defeating Greene, and he was willing to risk his entire army to achieve this goal. For the Americans, the psychological challenges were different but equally severe. They were retreating from an enemy they had just defeated at Cowpens, which created mental conflict among troops who wanted to fight. Greene had to constantly reassure his men that they were not running in defeat but carrying out a strategy that would lead to ultimate victory. The prisoners captured at Cowpens created additional complications for the American retreat. These men had to be guarded and fed, which reduced the number of American soldiers available for fighting and increased the logistical burden on the army. At the same time, the prisoners were valuable assets that could be exchanged for or captured. Americans were used to demonstrate British vulnerability to potential allies as both armies approached the Don River, which forms the border between North Carolina and Virginia. The race reached its peak. Greene had been maneuvering toward this crossing for weeks, knowing that if he could get his army across the river, he would achieve several strategic objectives at the same time. First, crossing into Virginia would place his army in friendly territory where he could resupply and reinforce. Virginia had not been occupied by British forces and retained the governmental structure necessary to support American military operations. The state could provide food, ammunition, equipment, potentially additional troops for the Continental Army. Second, it would stretch Cornwallis's supply lines to the absolute breaking point. The British general was already operating hundreds of miles from his nearest secure base in Charleston. Every mile farther north increased the difficulty of maintaining communications and supply lines, while simultaneously moving deeper into territory controlled by American forces. Third, crossing the Dan would show the world that British forces, despite their tactical victories, could not control the territory they claimed to have conquered. This would have important implications for international support, particularly French assistance, which was crucial to American success. Greene's preparations for the river crossing demonstrated his attention to logistical detail. He had secretly arranged for boats to be positioned at Boyd's Ferry on the Dan River, hidden from British observation and guarded by Virginia militia. when the American army arrived at the crossing point, transportation would be immediately available, allowing them to get across the river before British pursuit could catch them. The general also spread false information about his intentions, suggesting to various sources that he intended to cross at different locations along the river. This forced Cornwallis to spread his forces to cover multiple possible crossing points, reducing the strength available to pursue the main American force. The final phase of the race was the most dramatic and desperate. Both armies were exhausted, hungry, and pushed to their absolute limits. British advance units were sometimes only hours behind the American rearguard. Soldiers on both sides were collapsing from exhaustion, and the pursuit had taken on an unreal quality, as if two armies of ghosts were chasing each other through a frozen wasteland. On February 14th, 1781, Greene's rearguard crossed the Dan River into Virginia, and the boats were immediately moved to the Virginia side of the river. When Cornwallis arrived at the crossing point later that day, he found the river between him and his target, with no boats available for immediate pursuit. The British general stood on the banks of the Dan River and realized that his army was now hundreds of miles from safety, deep in enemy territory with dwindling supplies and no hope of immediate reinforcement. The race to the Dan had accomplished exactly what Greene intended. Cornwallis's army, though undefeated in battle, was strategically defeated. They had been led on a chase that consumed precious weeks of campaigning time, exhausted their troops, devastated their supplies, placed them in an impossible strategic position. The British general had no choice but to begin a retreat of his own, abandoning the territory he had spent months conquering. But Greene was far from finished with his strategic masterpiece. Having successfully drawn the British army away from their bases and into the wilderness, he now began the second phase of his campaign. Instead of remaining safely in Virginia, he quickly recrossed the Dan with a portion of his force, launching a series of strikes against British outposts and supply lines that had been left vulnerable by Cornwallis's pursuit. This phase of the campaign demonstrated Greene's understanding of what would later be called guerrilla warfare principles. Small American forces moving quickly and striking unexpectedly began to reclaim territory that the British thought they had secured. These operations were perfectly coordinated with local militia forces, creating a network of resistance that made it impossible for the British to maintain control over any significant area. Local patriot militias, emboldened by the obvious difficulties of the British army and encouraged by Greene's demonstration that American forces could outmaneuver their pursuers, began to emerge from hiding and actively support the American cause. This created a snowball effect as success bred success, and resistance spread throughout the region. Cornwallis found himself in a strategic nightmare. He couldn't catch Greene's main force, which remained tantalizingly close, but always just out of reach. At the same time, he couldn't ignore the growing threat to his rear areas, where American forces were systematically destroying the network of loyalist support that British success in the South depended upon. Every day that Cornwallis remained in the field, his army grew weaker while American resistance grew stronger. His supply lines were under constant attack. His communications with Charleston were uncertain at best. And his troops were suffering from the combined effects of the grueling march and the harsh winter conditions. The hunter had become the hunted, and the British general was slowly realizing that he had been outmaneuvered by a strategic genius. The psychological impact of the race to the dawn extended far beyond the immediate military situation. Word spread throughout the American colonies that a small continental force had led the mighty British army on a wild chase through the wilderness and had not only escaped, but had turned the tables on their pursuers. This news had an electrifying effect on American morale at a time when the revolution seemed to be failing in the South. The story of the race resonated with Americans on multiple levels. It showed that American generals could match British commanders in strategic thinking and execution. It showed that American soldiers despite their lack of formal training and equipment, possessed the courage and endurance necessary to prevail against professional European troops. Most importantly, it proved that the American cause was far from defeated and that ultimate victory remained possible. The international implications were equally significant. European observers, particularly the French, were watching the Southern campaign closely to assess whether continued support for the American cause was justified. The race to the Danube demonstrated that American forces possessed not only the will to continue fighting, but also the strategic skill necessary to ultimately prevail against British arms. French military observers were particularly impressed by Greene's unconventional tactics and strategic vision. The campaign represented a new form of warfare that challenged traditional European military thinking and suggested that American military leadership had evolved beyond mere tactical competence to true strategic brilliance. The race also had deep effects on British strategy throughout the South, and indeed throughout the war. It forced British planners to recognize that controlling territory in America was far more difficult than winning battles. Local populations might submit temporarily after a British victory, but they would rise in rebellion as soon as British forces moved on to other objectives. The vast distances and hostile terrain of the American backcountry made it impossible to maintain control without permanently stationing large numbers of troops, which the British simply didn't have available. Every garrison weakened field armies, while every concentration of field forces left territory vulnerable to American counterattacks. British leaders began to understand that the American Revolution represented a fundamentally different type of conflict than the European wars they were used to fighting. Traditional military methods, which had proven successful in Europe and other parts of the British Empire, proving inadequate against an enemy that refused to fight according to conventional rules. After weeks of pointless maneuvering in the North Carolina wilderness, Cornwallis realized that his only option was to force a big battle with Greene's army. If he could destroy the American force in a single engagement, he might salvage something from the campaign and restore British prestige in the South. This decision led directly to the Battle of Guilford Courthouse on March 15, 1781, which would prove to be the perfect culmination of Greene's strategic masterpiece. The American general, recognizing that battle was now unavoidable, chose his ground carefully to maximize British casualties while minimizing his own losses. Greene's deployment at Guilford Courthouse was a masterpiece of tactical planning that reflected his deep understanding of both his own forces and those of his enemy. He positioned his troops in 3 defensive lines, each designed to inflict maximum damage on attacking British forces while preserving American strength for the final phase of the battle. The first line consisted of North Carolina militia positioned behind a fence with clear fields of fire to their front. These men were instructed to fire 2 fires at the advancing British and then withdraw to predetermined positions. This line was not expected to hold against British attack, but rather to disrupt enemy formations and inflict casualties before pulling back. The second line, positioned several hundred yards behind the first, was composed of Virginia militia with more military experience. These troops were expected to put up more determined resistance, but were also given permission to withdraw when pressed too hard. Their mission was to further disrupt British attacks and inflict additional casualties. The third and final line consisted of Greene's most reliable troops, Continental soldiers, and veteran militia units. These men were positioned on ground of their own choosing, with clear fields of fire and prepared positions. They would bear the main force of the British assault and were expected to fight with determination before conducting a planned withdrawal. The formation was designed not to win the battle in the traditional sense of holding the field, but to make the British pay such a devastating price for victory that it would be strategically meaningless. Greene understood that Cornwallis had to attack, as remaining passive would allow the Americans to continue their harassment operations indefinitely. The British attack at Guilford Courthouse unfolded exactly as Greene had planned. Cornwallis's troops, displaying the courage and discipline that had made them feared throughout the war, advanced against each American line in turn. They drove back the North Carolina militia, overwhelmed the Virginia line, and finally engaged the Continental troops in desperate hand-to-hand fighting. The fighting was some of the most intense of the Revolutionary War. British soldiers, despite their exhaustion from the long pursuit, fought with characteristic determination. The 23rd Regiment of Foot, the Royal Welch Fusiliers, advanced with fixed bayonets against American positions that seemed impossible to capture. The 33rd Regiment of Foot, Cornwallis's old command, charged repeatedly against prepared American defenses, taking terrible casualties but never giving ground. American resistance was equally determined. Continental soldiers who had endured the hardships of the race to the Dan were not about to give up the field easily to their tormentors. Militia units that had been dismissed as unreliable by previous commanders fought with unexpected stubbornness, inspired by Greene's confidence in them and their own growing experience. The climax of the battle came when British forces finally reached the American third line, only to find themselves engaged in a confusing fight in wooded terrain that negated many of their tactical advantages. British discipline and training were still superior, but the Americans fought with the desperation of men who knew that defeat meant the end of the revolution in the South. At the crucial moment, Greene made the decision that defined his entire strategy. Rather than commit his reserves in a final effort to hold the field, he ordered a general withdrawal that preserved the bulk of his army while leaving the British in possession of an empty victory. The statistics of the Battle of Guilford Courthouse tell the story of Greene's strategic success. The British lost over 500 men, including a high proportion of officers and experienced non-commissioned officers whose leadership was irreplaceable. These casualties represented nearly a quarter of Cornwallis's effective strength and included veterans whose experience could not be replaced by any amount of training. American losses, while significant, were far less devastating in strategic terms. Greene lost about 400 men, but many of these were militia who could potentially be replaced by local recruitment. More importantly, he preserved the core of his Continental force, maintaining an army being that could continue to threaten British positions throughout the South. Charles James Fox, a member of the British Parliament, perfectly captured the strategic significance of the battle when he observed that another such victory would ruin the British army. Cornwallis had won the field, but at a cost that made continued operations impossible. The aftermath of Guilford Courthouse proved every aspect of Greene's strategy correct. Cornwallis held the battlefield, but found himself in a worse position than before the engagement. His army was too weakened to pursue Greene effectively, too far from supplies to remain in place, and too damaged to continue the campaign in any meaningful way. The British general faced a series of impossible choices, all of which had been created by Greene's strategic brilliance. He could attempt to pursue the American army, but his weakened force was no match for Greene's intact army operating on familiar ground. He could remain in North Carolina and attempt to hold territory, but his supply lines were under constant attack, and his forces were inadequate to garrison the vast area effectively. He could retreat to Charleston, but this would abandon all the territory conquered in the previous year and represent a complete strategic defeat. Cornwallis chose a fourth option that proved to be even more disastrous. He decided to march his remaining forces to Virginia, where he hoped to link up with British forces operating under Benedict Arnold and establish a more secure base of operations. This decision, which seemed logical at the time, set in motion the chain of events that would lead directly to Yorktown and the effective end of the Revolutionary War. The march to Virginia was itself a strategic retreat disguised as an advance. By abandoning the Carolinas, Cornwallis was acknowledging that Greene's strategy had succeeded completely. The British Southern strategy, which had seemed so promising after the victories at Charleston and Camden, lay in ruins. American forces were once again active throughout the region. British supply lines were shattered, and Loyalist support had largely disappeared. Greene's losing battles to win the campaign strategy had achieved something that direct confrontation could never have accomplished. By avoiding big engagements while constantly threatening British positions, he had forced his opponents into a series of strategic errors that ultimately cost them the war. The principles demonstrated during the race to the Dan and the later campaign would influence military thinking for generations to come. The idea that a weaker force could defeat a superior one through strategic excellence rather than tactical superiority became a cornerstone of American military doctrine. Greene's understanding of the relationship between military operations and political objectives was particularly advanced for his era. He recognized that the Revolutionary War was not simply a military conflict, but a struggle for the loyalty, support of the American people. Every British victory that came at a high cost, every successful American retreat that preserved Patriot forces, and every day that American resistance continued served to undermine British political objectives. The integration of regular Continental forces with local militia units was another innovation that would prove influential in future conflicts. By combining professional soldiers with part-time citizen soldiers, Greene created a flexible military system that could adapt to changing circumstances and take advantage of local knowledge and popular support. Perhaps most importantly, Greene demonstrated that warfare in the American environment required different strategies and tactics than those that had proven successful in Europe. The vast distances, sparse population, and hostile terrain of the American backcountry made traditional European military methods ineffective and required innovative approaches that emphasized mobility, local knowledge, and political awareness. The psychological aspects of Greene's strategy were equally sophisticated and forward-looking. By constantly threatening British positions without committing to big battles, he created a sense of uncertainty and vulnerability that undermined enemy morale while maintaining the confidence of his own forces. His troops understood that they were carrying out a clear strategy rather than simply retreating in defeat, which maintained their fighting spirit despite the hardships they endured. Greene's communication with his officers and men was crucial to the success of his strategy. He constantly explained his plans and objectives, helping his subordinates understand how their individual actions served the larger cause. This communication was essential in maintaining discipline and unity during the difficult retreat and the later campaign. The international implications of Greene's campaign were also significant and far-reaching. European military observers were fascinated by his unconventional tactics and began to study American methods of warfare with new respect. The campaign contributed to a growing recognition that American military leaders had developed innovative approaches to warfare that were worthy of serious study and copying. The French, in particular, were impressed by Greene's demonstration that American forces could neutralize British military advantages through superior strategy and determination. This impression strengthened French commitment to the American cause at a crucial moment when continued support was by no means guaranteed. The campaign also had important effects on American civil-military relations and the development of American military institutions. Greene's success showed that American generals could match their European counterparts in strategic thinking and operational execution. This recognition helped establish the credibility of American military leadership and contributed to the development of a professional American military tradition. The emphasis on mobility, flexibility, and adaptation to local conditions that characterized Greene's campaign became fundamental principles of American military doctrine. These concepts would prove valuable in numerous future conflicts, from the War of 1812 through the Civil War and beyond. As American forces faced the challenge of operating across vast distances and diverse terrain, Greene's integration of political and military considerations also established important precedents for future American military leaders. His understanding that military success must serve political goals and that political support was essential for military success became a cornerstone of American strategic thinking. The logistical innovations developed during the Southern Campaign were equally influential. Greene's ability to maintain military operations with minimal supply lines and limited resources demonstrated the importance of living off the land and using local resources. These techniques would prove essential in future American military operations, particularly during the westward expansion across the continent, as news of the campaign's success spread throughout America and Europe. Its historical significance became increasingly clear. Military historians recognized that Greene had carried out one of the most sophisticated strategic campaigns in military history, demonstrating how apparent weakness could be transformed into ultimate strength through superior planning and execution. The race to the Dan became a classic case study, taught in military academies around the world. Future military leaders studied Greene's campaign to understand how weaker forces could defeat superior ones through strategic excellence, innovative tactics, and superior understanding of the political dimensions of warfare. The campaign also contributed to the broader understanding of revolutionary warfare and the principles that govern conflicts between professional armies and popular insurgencies. Greene's methods showed how insurgent forces could neutralize the advantages of conventional armies by refusing to fight on their enemy's terms while maintaining constant pressure through harassment and deception. For the immediate participants in the campaign, the race to the dawn represented the peak of their service in the Revolutionary War. The soldiers who endured that grueling march through the Carolina wilderness had participated in one of the most remarkable military achievements in American history. Their sacrifice and endurance made possible the strategic victory that ultimately secured American independence. The British soldiers who participated in the pursuit also deserved recognition for their courage and determination under impossible conditions. They fought with characteristic bravery and discipline, following their officers into a strategic trap that was not of their making. Their ultimate defeat took nothing away from their individual valor and professionalism. Lord Cornwallis, despite his strategic errors, remained a powerful military commander whose tactical abilities were never in question. His decision to pursue Greene was understandable given the military conventions of the time and the pressure to restore British prestige after the defeat at Cowpens. The fault lay not in his personal courage or tactical skill, but in his failure to recognize that he was facing an opponent who understood warfare at a deeper level than conventional military thinking allowed. The civilian populations of the Carolinas and Virginia bore perhaps the heaviest burden of the campaign. Their farms were stripped of supplies by both armies. Their homes were occupied by soldiers, and their communities were torn apart by the conflict between patriots and loyalists. The race to the Dan brought the full horror of war directly into their lives, forcing them to choose sides and live with the consequences of their decisions, despite the suffering it caused. The campaign ultimately benefited the civilian population by hastening the end of the war in the South. Greene's strategic success made continued British resistance impossible and paved the way for the restoration of civil government under American control. As Greene's army finally established itself in Virginia, having successfully completed one of the most remarkable strategic campaigns in military history, the general could reflect on the complete success of his bold strategy. He had inherited a broken army in an apparently hopeless situation and had transformed it into an effective instrument of strategic victory. The race to the Dan had accomplished everything Greene had hoped when he first thought of his plan. It had drawn British forces away from their secure bases, exhausted their strength, shown that American resistance could not be crushed by conventional military means, and set in motion the chain of events that would ultimately lead to British defeat at Yorktown. Looking back on the race to the Dan from the perspective of more than 2 centuries, its significance only becomes clearer. It represents one of the finest examples of strategic thinking in military history, a masterclass in how to transform apparent weakness into ultimate strength through intelligence, determination, and innovative thinking. Nathanael Greene's brilliance lay not in his ability to win battles through superior tactics or overwhelming force, but in his understanding that wars are won through the smart application of strategic principles rather than through tactical superiority alone. He recognized that in a revolutionary war, the ultimate objective was not to defeat British armies in battle, but to convince the British government that the cost of maintaining control over America exceeded any possible benefit. The campaign showed that in warfare, as in many other aspects of life, success often comes not from doing what is expected or conventional, but from having the vision to see what is truly necessary and the courage to act on that vision, regardless of how it might appear to others. Greene was willing to appear to be retreating in defeat because he understood that this apparent retreat would lead to ultimate victory. The race to the Dan stands as an enduring testament to the power of strategic thinking, the importance of understanding the true nature of any conflict, and the ability of determined people to overcome seemingly impossible odds through intelligence, perseverance, and unwavering commitment to their principles. Nathaniel Greene's legacy extends far beyond his specific military achievements. He showed that American leadership possessed the strategic sophistication necessary to prevail against any opponent, and that American forces could adapt and innovate when conventional methods proved inadequate. His example inspired future generations of American military leaders and contributed to the development of a uniquely American approach to warfare that emphasized flexibility, innovation, and political awareness. The story of the race to the Dan is ultimately a story about the triumph of intelligence over force, strategy over tactics, and long-term vision over short-term considerations. It reminds us that in any conflict, victory belongs not necessarily to the strongest or most numerous, but to those who best understand the true nature of the struggle they are engaged in and who possess the wisdom and determination to act on that understanding today. As we face our own challenges and struggles, the example of Nathaniel Greene in the race to the Dan continues to inspire and instruct. It shows us that even in the darkest moments, when defeat seems certain and hope appears lost, the right strategy, executed with determination and skill, can still achieve impossible and change the course of history. The principles that guided Greene's campaign: understanding your enemy's weaknesses, playing to your own strengths, thinking strategically rather than just tactically, and maintaining the support of the population, remain as relevant today as they were in 1781, whether in military affairs, business, politics, or personal challenges. These timeless lessons continue to offer guidance for overcoming obstacles and achieving seemingly impossible goals. This has been Historic America, bringing you the incredible stories of courage, strategy, and determination that forged our nation. Nathaniel Greene's race to the Dan reminds us that sometimes the most brilliant victories come not from charging forward into battle, but from having the wisdom to retreat at the right time, the strategy to turn apparent defeat into ultimate triumph, and the vision to see beyond immediate circumstances to the larger possibilities that await those who refuse to give up. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the Revolutionary War's most brilliant strategic campaigns, make sure to subscribe to History USA and hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest episodes. Check out our complete Revolutionary War playlist for more incredible stories of American courage and ingenuity. Share this video with anyone who loves military history, strategic thinking, or just incredible stories of human determination. Until next time, remember that history is not just about the past. It's about understanding how the courage, intelligence, and strategic vision of previous generations can inspire us to face our own challenges with equal determination and wisdom. The legacy of Nathaniel Greene and the race to the Dan lives on, wherever people refuse to accept defeat and have the vision to turn their greatest challenges into their most remarkable victories.